just to touch on what Don said before we get into our lesson this morning. We are doing the fifth Sunday singing this month that we do with Antioch and Mount View a few times a year. That'll be the 29th, I think it is. Whatever the fifth Sunday is in March, that'll be our fifth Sunday, and we'll have that here at Nat Hill that night. And Don said we'll swap preachers that morning too. I was talking to Larry and JD from Mount View in Antioch, and they asked about food, and I said, that's up to you ladies if you want to prepare something. I'm not going to, make a decision on that because that's not really my place to, but just, if you want to prepare food, if you don't, that's fine. Just think about that in the meantime. Our lesson this morning comes from Acts 14, 21 through 23 that was read to us just a moment ago. And it's a topic that might on the surface seem kind of irrelevant to us for this congregation because we don't have men that serve as elders here. But I learned last week that Hickerson Station on the way to Tullahoma, which they have a size comparable to us in attendance, they installed elders there, which is great. But it is something that we need to be reminded of from time to time because the New Testament talks about elders and the role they play with the local congregation. A lot of different terms they're referred to as. You see them called elders, you see them called overseers, you see them called shepherds, you see them called pastors. Now, I'm not a pastor in the sense that I'm an elder because a pastor is an elder, but we'll talk about that in a moment. But our base text will come from Acts 14, 21 through 23, and we'll talk about some other passages as we go along. And I wanted to give a little bit of a background to this passage where we're at in Acts. Paul is still on his first missionary journey. We looked at the passage a few weeks ago in Acts 13 where he preached his first recorded sermon in that synagogue in Antioch. We talked about that a little bit. There are some things that have happened since then for Paul. He has traveled some more. He's gone to Cyprus. He's gone to the Isle of Cyprus there. He's converted some people along that way. He's gone to Iconium and Lystra and Derbe. Don read that for us a moment ago. And you've noticed so far that as far as the church was concerned, their home base was the congregation in Antioch up to this point. That was really where they did all their operations. And Paul and Barnabas and the others go back to all those congregations they'd been to before. And one of the things that they did when they went back was they appointed elders in every church. You notice Paul said that. Now, that gives us some information because, well, is it unscriptural to have a church without elders? And the answer is no, because these churches didn't before Paul and Barnabas went back. But should you get complacent that way? Should you just be content with not having elders and say, well, we don't have them, we've never have had them, so we shouldn't desire them? And the answer to that, I think, is no also. Because if we want to develop men that can serve in that capacity, and I know that's one of our goals for the future here, at least it is for me. But you think about this thing with elders, because you think about developing leaders and men that can serve as elders. Do we need leaders in life? Do we need leaders for the things that we try to do in life? Well, we always need leaders, whatever we do, don't we? Because what do good leaders do? Don't good leaders set an example for the rest of us to follow? I mean, if you think about elders in the church, that's the example they try to set for all of us. But Paul goes to these churches and they appoint elders in every church. One letter that Paul wrote to Titus, we have Paul writing to Titus in the letter that bears his name. Paul wrote to Titus to help him tell him to appoint elders in every church, every town as I directed you. So this was something that was a priority for Paul. And the question comes up when we think about this: why does God desire that every congregation of his church have men to serve as elders? Why should we look after that? And the basic answer is accountability, because if you have godly men that function in that capacity, it helps the church to be accountable the way that it needs to be, to help the members to be accountable the way they need to be. Because I've heard it said before that the job of elders is to make sure that the members of their congregation get to heaven. And that's correct, because they're the shepherds over those people's souls. And in some sense, the members of the church are accountable to the elders there. Now, all of us are accountable to God. We understand that. But granting that those men that serve as elders are godly, aren't we also accountable to them? Well, we have an obligation to obey them, don't we? So we're going to have two main sections this morning as we think about elders. And I wanted to talk first of all about the names that we give to elders. And we've mentioned some of those already, but we'll go through them here. And there are some other passages we'll go to besides Acts to talk about this, because Paul mentions them in some of his other writings. But we'll start with the name elder first, because that's an easy place to start. What does it mean when he calls someone elder? Now, I wouldn't advise you to call someone old man, but that might be a little bit ill-advised. But elder just means an older person, right? Someone that's older. And that's the idea behind this word in Scripture. When you think about a man that's going to serve the congregation as an elder, he's first of all an older man. We don't have any specific age given for him. We don't have an age limit for him, but his age isn't as important as his maturity spiritually. Because would it be more important for a man serving a church as an elder to be of a certain age or be of a certain spiritual maturity? You'd want them to be someone who's serious about God and religion, wouldn't you? One of the more plain passages that talks about that is 1 Timothy chapter 3, if you want to turn over there. In 1 Timothy chapter 3, you notice some more of what Paul says about that office of elders. In 1 Timothy 3, picking up at verse 1, the saying is trustworthy. If anyone aspires to the office of overseer, he desires a noble task. Therefore, an overseer must be above reproach, the husband of one wife, sober-minded, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not a drunkard, not violent, but gentle, not quarrelsome, not a lover of money. He must manage his own household well with all dignity, keeping his children submissive. For if someone does not know how to manage his own household, how will he care for God's church? He must not be a recent convert, or he may become puffed up with conceit and fall into the condemnation of the devil. When you think about an elder being mature, there are a couple of things you can draw from that. There are a couple of inferences you can make, because we talked about his age already, and what did Paul say there? That he has children. So an elder is someone old enough to be a father, right? Not just a father, but a father of believing children, a father of children that themselves are believers. Titus 1 verse 6 speaks about their children being believers. Now, if your children are Christians, doesn't that imply that the children are of a certain age? They wouldn't be like 2 or 3 or 4, right? They'd be old enough to where they can understand the Bible and sin and redemption and so forth. So you're not talking about a man that has children who are toddlers. You're talking about them that maybe not even 9 or 10 years old. Of course, you get into the discussion there of how old is a child when they can really understand sin and things. And that's another discussion to get into. But I think safe assumption would be at least teenage years, wouldn't you? It's a pretty valid place to put that. That's just my judgment on it. But Paul has in mind here children who are Christians and they're under the tutelage of their father, if their father's an elder. Elder is one term that we find for this office, but bishop is one that comes up too. You see the word bishop come up there, especially if you have an older translation. Same office, still talking about an elder. He oversees a local congregation with other elders and bishops, because remember, it's a plurality of them every time this comes up. And you think about the word bishop, the word in the original language is episcopo, and that sounds a lot like episcopal, right? But that's talking about the eldership. Overseer is a word that comes up for elders. What does it mean when you oversee something? I mean, if you think about someone at work, if you're overseeing someone do something, you're making sure they're doing everything that they need to do, aren't you? You're making sure that what they're doing is in a way that needs to be done. Are we engaged in work as Christians? Aren't we engaged in the Lord's work? Now, elders at the local congregation are overseeing that work, aren't they? They've got that responsibility to make sure that not only they themselves are doing what they need to do, but the church at large is. When you think about an elder being a husband and a father, is it just at the church that he's exercising good oversight, or does he also exercise it at home? Because Paul says in 1 Timothy 3 there, he must manage his own household well, keeping his children in submission. Because Paul asks the question, if he doesn't know how to manage his own household, how is he going to care for God's church? And the implied answer is pretty obviously that it would be really hard, if not impossible, to do that. That's a way to assess how a man might manage situations or problems that arise in the church. A third name we see for elders, and this is sort of two in one, shepherd/pastor. Now we hear the name pastor in the religious world, and usually we take that to mean the preacher. Now, a preacher could be a pastor technically if he's also one of the elders of that congregation, right? Doesn't that make sense? But the word pastor, when it comes up in the New Testament, is talking about a man that serves with other elders at a church. Someone that shepherds the flock, someone that oversees the sheep. And 1 Peter 5 is one passage where this shows up. Peter, you might remember, was also an elder. I've heard some people say that it's a conflict of interest to be a preacher and an elder. I don't know that I agree with that, because Peter was both. But that's another discussion to get into. But 1 Peter 5, verses 1 through 3, Peter said, I exhort the elders among you as a fellow elder and a witness of the sufferings of Christ, as well as a partaker in the glory that is going to be revealed. He tells them in verse 2, shepherd the flock of God that is among you, exercising oversight, not under compulsion, but willingly, as God would have you, not for shameful gain, but eagerly, not domineering those over your charge, but being examples to the flock. Well, when you talk about a shepherd and you talk about a flock, what animal immediately comes to mind? Wayne knows. Sheep, right? And Wayne would be one of the best people to ask this. Are sheep sometimes stubborn? Are they sometimes hard to manage or herd? They are, aren't they? They can be a little bit difficult to deal with sometimes. It'd be convenient if they always did what they wanted us to, wouldn't it? Peter tells his fellow elders here, whoever might have been reading this letter, to pastor the flock of God. That plurality of elders pastoring the local congregation. Whether that's 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 men, however many it is. They're to feed the flock. They're to protect them, just like a shepherd would do with sheep. Do you think the elders at congregations that have them, do you think they're listening to what the preacher says when he's up in the pulpit to make sure that what he's actually teaching is the truth of the Bible that's being taught? They better be, because it's their job to do that. It's quite literally their job to look out for the congregation's spiritual health. Hebrews 13:17 is another passage where you go to when you think about elders. The Hebrews writer said, "Obey your leaders and submit to them, for they are keeping watch over your soul as those who will have to give an account." He tells his audience, "Let them do this with joy and not with groaning, for that would be of no advantage to you." Those are a lot of the descriptions we have for elders, all the words we see come up for elders. But I wanted to talk, number 2, about the fact that being an elder is a work. You think about work, you know work is something that involves labor and effort, and we should never view the eldership as something that's just a casual thing. We should never view it as something where we think, well, I'll do it, I guess. If nobody else is going to do it, I will. In 1 Timothy 3, verse 1, if we go back to that, Paul said, if anyone aspires to the office of an overseer, he desires a noble task. What does it mean if you aspire to do something? If you aspire to be something, doesn't that mean that you want it? You want to engage in it? Well, Paul was talking here about men that would aspire to be an overseer. Should a man be an elder just because of the recognition and being in the spotlight, or should he do it because of the role and the work that it consists of, the good that it tries to do? Well, he should do it because it's best for the church. When you think about an eldership being a work, the emphasis is on the work, not the position that you're in. It's not the fact that you're in the spotlight or whatever we want to say. He shouldn't take the approach of nobody else is going to do it and I don't really want to do it, so I will. That's not the way he should go about it. He ought to have the attitude that I want to put time and effort and energy into something that God has given me the opportunity to do. Because isn't that an awesome responsibility when you think about taking care of God's flock? God's entrusted you to look after them if you're an elder. And you'd better take that responsibility seriously. 1 Timothy 5:17, Paul talks about it being a work that's important. He said, let the elders who rule well be considered worthy of double honor, especially those who labor in preaching and teaching. He talks about them ruling well. They have a pattern of good leadership. And he says they're worthy of double honor. Now that gets into an interesting discussion because churches pay preachers a salary, but when have you ever heard about churches paying the eldership? Probably haven't ever heard of it, have you? Now there's reasons for that because, well, money. A lot of congregations aren't financially able to pay an eldership and pay the minister both, but if they do have the financial means, wouldn't it be good for them to? That's the argument Paul's making here, because he's saying if they're the shepherds of God's flock, then aren't they just as worthy of that themselves? If we think about the idea of paying an eldership, is that wrong? Paul doesn't seem to suggest that it is. I mean, I've known of congregations that they pay the song leader. That's not bad. If the congregation can support them, right? Because we all know money adds up over time. But that's an interesting thing to consider when you think about the eldership being paid. But the hope is, if if that were to happen, Paul was saying that an elder could get some relief from their 9-to-5 job where they could fully focus on their duties as an elder. And if they can fully focus on their duties as an elder, then the church is going to be better because of it. That was Paul's argument. It's not just the work that those men are engaging in, it's hard work. It can be rewarding work. I mentioned Hickerson Station a moment ago. They're a congregation that's similar to us in a lot of ways, mainly because of their size. And most of the time when you think about small congregations in our area, you don't hear about them having an eldership, but there are some, and Hickerson's now one of them. And I bring them up to say this: it's not impossible for a small church to appoint men to serve in that capacity. But if you're going to appoint men to serve in that capacity, you have to develop leaders. You have to develop men that are spiritually minded and serious about serving God. And, well, that takes all of us, I think, to develop that attitude as a congregation. Because they have to desire that work. That's one thing, that if a church is going to have men qualified, the men have to desire the office. But as I said before, just because we haven't had them in a long time, that doesn't mean we should get complacent about not having them. We shouldn't have the attitude, I don't think, that, well, we haven't ever had them, so we might as well not ever have them. Because if God desires them to serve in every church, then don't you think we have the obligation to do whatever we can to help to make that happen? Because if the time comes in the future where we might have men who could qualify, I think it's our obligation to encourage them however we can. This isn't a lesson that necessarily warrants an invitation, but we always extend one. You think about those qualities that Paul mentions elders needing to possess. He mentions them being sober-minded, meaning that they're serious about their duties. They don't have a silly demeanor about them. They're not quick-tempered. They're not someone going around looking to start up fights. They're not greedy for money. They're thought of well by those in the community outside the church. People have good things to say about them. Aren't those qualities for all of us to possess in general as Christians? Well, yes, they are, but especially so for the eldership. And we ought to desire those qualities. If you're here this morning and you're not a Christian, if you've not taken those initial steps to become one, by repenting of your sins, by confessing faith in Christ, by being baptized, you can do that this morning if you haven't. If you've done that, but maybe God hasn't been the priority for you that He needs to be, you can make that right this morning too. If you need prayers for something in your life, whatever need you have, we'd ask you to come as we sing.
One, two, four.